friends give up on trying to save us. I hope we come up with a fail-safe plot to piss off the dumb few that forgave us. I hope the fences we mended fall down beneath their own weight, and I hope we hang on past the last exit. I hope it's already too late, and I hope the junkyard a few blocks from here someday burns down, and I hope the rising black smoke carries me far away, and I never come back to this town again. In my life, I hope I lie and tell everyone you were a good wife, and I hope you die. I hope we both die.
You're watching Fugitive Red-Eye, and welcome to another episode of OverAnalyzing, the series where I take a more in-depth look at the fictional universes which I love. Moral Orel. It's a series that I've talked about numerous times on the channel, and even had a few videos planned about it that never got finished. It's one of my all-time favorite shows, and it's easily my favorite dramedy. I don't normally script videos, but I've held a poll and the results were to script this one, which makes sense given it's intended to be an in-depth analysis of the character Clay Puppington. It's been no secret that Clay Puppington is my favorite character on Moral Orel, and that seems to be the case with a lot of the fan base. There have been plenty of great video essays people have done looking into and analyzing Clay as a character, but there's a common theme I've noticed with a lot of these videos. People don't sympathize with him. Obviously there's been a few where they do, but most of the time they don't. Clearly I'm not saying that the things Clay does, especially at the end of the series, are justified. Far from it. I just think it's unfair that people grant him zero sympathy. Not sympathizing with Clay would be one thing, but in fact a lot of people who don't sympathize with Clay do, for some reason, sympathize with Bloberta. As a matter of fact, the inspiration for this video started a while back when I was showing my friend Rem, also known as the Pitcher in the Sergeant Friends series, Moral Orel, while he was in turn showing me BoJack Horseman. I'd seen a little bit of BoJack Horseman before that. I'd seen the first 3 seasons, but he and I were finishing it together, and I was showing him Moral Orel to pair with it. The exact reason I decided to do this video was when watching it with him. At one point during season 3, he said, "Poor Bloberta," at which point I asked him, "Poor Bloberta? She's an awful mother," and then proceeded to have a long conversation about it, pointing out that she's just as bad, if not worse, in many cases. Since then, Rem has actually loosened up a bit and actually agrees with me that Bloberta is kind of a piece of shit too. Like, he doesn't really sympathize with her as much as he used to. Also, he agrees that Clay is his favorite character too. In this video, I intend to make the case that not only is Bloberta, for the most part, the worst parent, although Clay's lowest moment is worse, she is worse overall. But I intend to establish the point that Clay Puppington is, as the title states, a man ruined by women. Then further, I plan to show that Clay actually cared a lot more than most give him credit for. He was just a broken man, and yes, a flawed man who does things which are not justifiable. I'll start with my premise before I get to examples within the show. In my view, Clay Puppington is a man who was traumatized as a child, then thrust into a marriage which he had no desire to be in, driven to alcoholism, and trying in his own twisted way to be a good father. I think Clay's goal for Orel is for his son to be a better man than he himself is, and to try and give a good example of what a man should be. Even if Clay himself doesn't live up to the facade he puts on, Clay knows what an honorable man is, and that's why he constantly pretends he is one, and puts on qualities that he ultimately doesn't possess. Hypocritical, yes, but in a way, caring. Clay constantly teaches Orel lessons at the end of most episodes, and tries to get Orel to be a better man. He takes Orel on the hunting trip to try and bond with him, and ultimately didn't have him use Old Gunny, which was a family tradition. Not as a dig at Orel, but after reflecting on the bad memories associated with the gun, as well as his father, which we'll get into later. Now I'd like to compare Clay and Bloberta as far as parenting. Bloberta constantly ignores her children, showing basically no care for their well-being. She's often shown caring more about cleaning products than Shapey, and when Shapey was mistakenly sent to another family, only wants him back because she's sentimental about him being all she has left of Coach Stopframe. In her words, she wants him back for sentimental reasons. And it took her a long-ass time to notice that the kids were even switched. Shapey is always getting into dangerous situations, and she clearly doesn't care. He literally chastises Orel for trying to stop Shapey from doing something dangerous, like pointing a BB gun in his eye. Literally, she would rather Shapey horribly hurt himself than not get what he wants. Meanwhile, Clay is almost always willing to listen to Orel's questions and provide him advice. He's always trying to teach him a lesson and trying to get him to be a better man. Now, you may point out that Clay doesn't give a shit about Shapey, which is true, but Shapey isn't his son. And it's a bit unfair that he's expected to just sit back and take that. His wife was unfaithful and had a kid with another man. Now, it's true that Clay is also unfaithful, but ironically, it's with the same person, Coach Stopframe. Also, hookers. In fairness to Clay, he didn't cheat first. He does get a little flirty on his wedding night, but another pretty important thing to note is that Clay never wanted to marry Bloberta in the first place, which I'll get more into later. Clay obviously does some pretty bad things as the series progresses, the worst of which obviously culminates in him shooting Orel in the episode Nature, after which Orel loses respect for his father and begins to question his entire worldview. It's fair that Orel doesn't forgive Clay for this. I wouldn't try to justify it. But this was the end result of Clay's deterioration and becoming increasingly unhinged. For most of the series, we see Clay able to restrain himself for the most part, and keep the facade going. In Nature, though, he finally breaks down, and the mask slips.
I gotta tell you, Orel. Your cup is always half empty. Now look at me. You should be more like your old man and look on the bright side of life.
Blight?
I didn't say bright. I said blight. My life is sunny and blight. Bright means the opposite. It means sudden, withering death. And that's... oh, my Kimmy. My life is full of bright.
You mean blight?
Oh, God.
What's the matter?
I hate myself. Why do you quit working on me? She always fools me, Orel. I'll make things better, dear. Drink me, put me inside you. I'm great. And she chokes me just like every other whore out there. They're all worthless, kid. Every woman. Don't let them get you. All of them want to get you. They just grab you and pull you into them. And you're forced to stay in and pull out, stay in and pull out. And then they got you. And they grip you by the right where it goes. And then they start squeezing.
I think that the speech itself was a bit of reflection that Clay needed, and it was the first time he truly opened up to someone, and that someone ended up being Orel, further showing that he's the person that he cares most about. But the issue is that he had his child with him, which is the main issue with him in that scene. No child should witness that. As a husband, Clay is not shown to be as bad as some people may think either. Once again, he wasn't the first to cheat, at least not from what the series depicts. He didn't want to even get married in the first place, which again I'll cover more in a bit. But on top of that, Bloberta is always being a bitch, and despite that, he never hits her or anything like that. Hell, he hardly shouts at her. Their arguments typically have them both pretty much on the same level of hostility. And more often than not, he shuts down and gets drunk. Clay was bottling up his emotions under a smokescreen of what he sees that a man should be, until his breaking point. We further see him break down and sacrifice.
You know, the pain of you, day in, day out, being there with that face, not knowing what to say, not caring anymore, not even knowing that you'll probably only care about her when it's finally too late. Forgetting about all those desperate years you spent alone, your barren years when no woman would even consider resting her tired head on your shaky little shoulder, and stinking of belly semen. Why even wipe? And then when you finally get one of these covered in pieces of tail that have been built up as the grand trophy in your nothing life, you try desperately to keep it. Not to protect it, but to hoard it. To keep it away from the other wolves and jackals circling your territory. And you realize, all too soon, that you're not good enough. That maybe there was a jerk-off called Darwin after all. And that you never acknowledged his existence because you knew deep inside that you were really what you feared you were. Weak and passive and ultimately broken by the ones who were made the fittest. And that through your weaknesses you built up a poison that poisoned others around you. That you loved. And the only true justice was to let those dominant jackals feed on you, survive off you.
Now, among other things, we do hear him say that he loves his family, pointing out how he sacrificed his happiness and got nothing in return, saying how he poisons everyone around him, and he's not good enough for them, coming to the conclusion that the only real justice was to let a more dominant man take the role from him and consume him. This shows that he wants to be there and sacrifice for his family, but is expected to get nothing in return, while at the same time feeling completely inadequate and ultimately hopeless. Speaking of love, Clay has a very interesting take on love, which I think is worth discussing. I actually kind of agree that you only have so much love in you that you have to divide up amongst people. If you try to have massive love for everyone, you'll go crazy trying to be loyal to everyone all the time, making it harder to pick sides and to know where you stand, which will drive you crazy and tear you apart whenever conflict arises. It's impossible to remain loyal to everyone all the time, and I think you should prioritize the most important relationships over ones that don't matter as much. Now on to the meat and potatoes of this video. Why do I say Clay was broken by women? That's actually pretty easy to see if you've seen Season 3. Obviously, women aren't the only ones who influence Clay into becoming the wreck he is, but they are by far the bulk of it. To start off with, at a young age, his mother was incredibly overprotective, due to multiple miscarriages, lying to Clay about the fact that he was an only child, and making up a ton of fake commandments to shelter him and protect him, to a fault. This made him ridiculously entitled and not have any hardships pressed upon him, which, in turn, makes him completely unprepared in dealing with pretty much any real conflict. Her overprotective coddling ultimately led Clay to snap and fake his death to spite her, which in turn killed her from shock, also causing Clay's relationship with his father to become increasingly strained. And obviously his father is massively at fault here too, but we'll get into him a little later after I finish establishing the broken by women narrative I'm crafting here. The next and by far worst woman who impacted Clay was Bloberta. When Clay met Bloberta, it was completely by accident. He stumbled into the wrong church and ended up at a wedding. Bloberta herself felt massively inadequate because she'd been unable to find a husband despite her sisters being much more able to find one, and her mother making such a big deal out of it. Bloberta saw Clay, not as a person, but as an opportunity. At this point in the story, Clay didn't drink and actually seemed to be a pretty decent guy. Bloberta would be the change to that. She pressures him into drinking in order to manipulate him into marrying her. It seems kind of crazy to me that if Clay had, gotten Bloberta drunk and had his way with her, people would act like that was unforgivable and think that he was an irredeemable character because of that. But when Bloberta literally gets Clay drunk and then makes him give up his entire life to be with her, that's somehow okay. See, that's why sympathizing with Bloberta makes no fucking sense. And remember, this is right fucking after they met. They hardly even knew each other, and she, in her desperation, gets him drunk, which leads to him becoming an alcoholic, and then takes advantage of his impaired state to manipulate him into marrying her. Now on to the last major woman who negatively affects Clay, Miss Censordoll. Admittedly, out of the three main women that impact Clay in the series, she has the least impact, as her interactions don't start until the episode before last, and he's already reached the bottom of his downward spiral. Not to mention that their disturbing time together is very brief. That said, she does still toy with him and take him down an increasingly degenerate path. She plays on his Oedipus complex he got from his clingy mother, and deteriorates his mental state. Now, women obviously aren't the only ones who drastically ruin Clay's life. There are some men in his life that have been awful as well. Take, for instance, Clay's father, who wouldn't put his own foot down and be the dominant man to counteract his wife's craziness. Then, after her tragic death, he doesn't comfort his son, no, he abuses him. It gets to the point that the abuse is the only interactions Clay gets from his father, craving it and feeling that it's some warped sense of love. Clay starts acting out intentionally to get beat, until eventually his father decides Clay is not even worth it.
You're not even worth it.
Not worth it?
He also ends the tradition of passing down Old Gunny to his son by giving it to Clay without going on the hunting trip. Clay, in a way, probably thought that physically disciplining Orel was a way of showing love, as it was what he's experienced. Clay also decided to try and revive the hunting trip tradition to bond with Orel. He was even going to give Orel Old Gunny, but once he held it, he had all the painful memories flood back in of his father. So he gave Orel a different gun instead. Clay's father would go on to be a loving grandfather for the brief stint that Orel stayed with him, but that doesn't excuse how shit of a father he was to Clay. Clay's father isn't the only man who negatively impacts Clay. Take Coach Stopframe next, for instance. One of the worst and least healthy relationships to come to Clay. Stopframe is the man whose main focus is corrupting Clay into becoming unfaithful to his wife. And ironically, he was also the man who Clay's wife cheated with, and is the biological father of Shapey. Stopframe's role in Clay's life is entirely self-centered with no regard for Clay's well-being, and he is even a bad influence on Orel, taking him to a satanic orgy and telling him to get virgin blood. Now, all this said, Clay is obviously still a man with free will and ultimately does make mistakes himself. Obviously, I think the fact that he tries to teach Orel lessons and bond with him and genuinely listens to what he says shows that he's a man who cares for his son more than most people give him credit for. But he's still a very flawed man and has done his own set of mistakes and is obviously the only one in control of his own actions. Shooting Orel is the line that he crosses. It might not have been intentional, but his sheer malice and lack of care after the fact make it pretty obvious why Orel rightfully doesn't forgive him, completely spirals out of control after that point. So what's the point I'm trying to make with this video? Well, obviously, the inflammatory title was part of the desire that I had to do this, but I also wanted to point out sort of the hypocrisy people have when they don't have any sympathy for Clay. Well, it's true that I do put a lot of the blame on the people in Clay's life that influence him, because let's face it, we are a product of our upbringing and environment, as well as our genetics, and a few other things here and there. It is true, though, that Clay still had free will. I don't deny that Clay is a bad person, and ultimately a bad father in a lot of regards. I mean, he literally shot his fucking son, so obviously he's not Father of the Year. But despite that, Clay still grinned and bared it, and was raising Shapey for years, knowing that it wasn't his son. On top of that, he stayed with his wife for the sake of appearances mostly, admittedly, but also for their family. Obviously, I don't think the creator wanted Clay to be depicted in a particularly sympathetic light, but it's hard not to have at least some sympathy for him when you see the catalysts that led to him being the man that he becomes. And there actually is a way that I think that Clay succeeded in being a father. While it's true that it wasn't in the way that he might have intended, and it ultimately led to his son losing all respect for him, the epilogue at the end of the final episode, where Orel is shown in his ideal family married to Christina with his kids, is really heartwarming. And the fact that he still has the cross on the wall shows that he was able to keep his faith and the values that were instilled to him despite his terrible upbringing. So even though Clay didn't succeed in pulling off the way that he wanted to pull off raising his son, through the way that he did raise his son, even if it was out of spite, and even if it didn't turn out exactly as it should have, Orel still turned out a good person and was able to retain his faith. So in that regard, Clay succeeded in making his son a better person than he was. I like to think that sometime down the line they'd make up, but there's no indication of that. Like I said, knowing Orel, there's a good chance that I would like to think they would make up in the future. I like to think they would. That's my headcanon. That Orel, at some point down the line, maybe met up with Clay and they made amends. Maybe Clay's a better grandfather than he is a father, much like his own father was. That's a really nice thought to think about. Again, there's no indication of that, especially given the series' rushed ending. We don't really know what happens between Orel completely giving up on Clay and the time skip forward to Orel with his family in the future. Not to mention, Orel is still able to find honor in his father in the fact that he created him. That's the one good piece of advice that Coach Stopframe gives. It's kind of stupid that the creator tried to make you sympathize more with Stopframe at the end, where I think Stopframe is actually considerably more immoral than Clay, because his entire purpose was to destroy Clay's family, all for his own lust. So I think it's crazy that, again, the creator clearly wants you to sympathize with Stopframe more than Clay. It doesn't make any sense to me. Not to mention the fact that Stopframe literally creeps on the kids at his school when they're showering in PE. Like I said, he took Orel to a satanic orgy under the implication Orel would either get raped or sacrificed. He's clearly the most evil character in the show, and yet the creator clearly expects you to sympathize with him on a higher level than Clay, just because he has that one good dialogue with Orel in the final episode that's completely unearned, by the way, because Stopframe is the biggest piece of shit and had no bond with Orel prior to that. It's just out of nowhere. But on top of that, another character that people try to put on this pedestal is Stephanie, who's also a piece of shit. Don't get me wrong, I like Stephanie as a character to a degree, but she literally pierced an 11-year-old's dick. How is she a moral character? Ultimately, I view Clay as a tragic character. Yes, he becomes kind of a fucking monster, and, people rightfully identify that in their video essays. But I think they miss the tragedy in that Clay's a human too, and just wanted love and affection, and ultimately got trapped in a lifestyle that he had no want or desire for. That's what I have to say about Clay Puppington. He's my favorite character from Moral Orel. He's one of my favorite fictional characters, period. He is such an interesting psychological study on the type of person that he is. Obviously, he was made to be a satire of parents like the dad from Leave It to Beaver. I think that Dino Stamatopoulos also put some stuff of his own father in there. But nevertheless, Clay is a very interesting character. And I can't help but feel some sympathy for this guy. And I think it's ridiculous that people don't, yet feel sympathy for his bitch wife. This has been Fugitive Red-Eye. Have a good one. Toodles.
I am drowning. There is no sign of land. You are coming down with me. Hand in unlovable hand, and I hope you die. I hope we both die.
Tribe, the Fugitive Red Eye.